Thank you very much, Cindy. Thank you, Alan. And thank you to the National Australia Bank for having me to speak again. And thank you very much to all of you for getting up and coming here this morning. I feel a bit of a fraud because I recently adjusted my CV and they said, oh, could you put in some of the things you do on television? And I used to be on Inside Business, but perhaps the head of the ABC is getting a whole lot of funding cuts last night. He got axed at the end of last year. Alan Kohler, by the way, was very, very surprised that happened. He honestly thought that even though he was quitting, they'd appoint someone else to run the show. But no, the ABC axed it, so the ABC's got a very anti-business bias, we know that. Agony Uncles I had to put forward as a show that I've been involved in because it's the only one I'm currently doing. It has absolutely nothing to do with finance, but I do think it's quite amusing. Now, last night's budget, I've got to say I was a little bit disappointed. Before the Gulf War Mark II, the shock and awe campaign of 2003 when the Americans went into Iraq, that's what we were promised, shock and awe, all sorts of things that you hadn't seen before. So last night when I sat down at 7:30 in front of the ABC to watch the Treasurer's budget speech, I really hoped to hear something I hadn't already heard. Now, leaking is a bit of an art form up in Canberra. You know, the government, in my view, in the past month has been throwing ideas out there. Will this work? Will that work? What does the public think? Etc., etc. And as they had howls of outrage about, at what point a deficit levy should cut in, or whether petrol prices should go up or whatever, you can imagine that Joe Hockey and Matthias Cormann in between smoking their large cigars, which really was one of the dumbest things they chose to do in the last few days up in Canberra, especially where a photographer's watching them. But you can imagine that they were sort of changing the budget and so forth. But having said that, given the budget crisis, the budget emergency that we were constantly told about, with Labor's mismanagement and Labor's debt, etc., I really expected to see something last night that I hadn't already heard of before. Well, I was surprised. I was surprised because I wasn't surprised, because frankly, there was nothing in last night's budget that hadn't already been leaked. So that made it a little bit boring. Now, as Alan has pointed out, the government's forecast about economic growth and so forth are essentially, fairly conservative, not too adventurous, economic growth going up a bit, maybe unemployment coming down. Hopefully the mining phase of the economy will keep going on for a few years, but nothing very adventurous. In fact, a lot of last night's speech had a bit of Wayne Swan about it. I don't think Joe Hockey would appreciate me saying that. Because the surplus, now we were told that getting back to a surplus was a sign of a strong government, a good government, a responsible government. But it's not going to happen for 5 years. That's what Wayne Swan used to do. He'd say we're on the path back to surplus, then 6 months, 12 months later, well, the path has taken a different direction again. Well, this one is a bit the same. I mean, there isn't that sense that we're really changing things. I do think, notwithstanding the rhetoric, that last night was more like fiddling at the edges. And I was intrigued to see that on the NAB's sort of Twitter graph thing there before with circles rotating around each other, much like a map of the solar system, that the only online reaction that was neutral was business, and the only one that was positive was other, whatever other is. Everything else was negative. So maybe a lot of people were like me and they were hoping to see something more entertaining. Okay, so the cliches. One thing I wasn't disappointed about last night was Joe Hockey's cliches. He had a lot of them. He said that we had to have a stronger Australia. That's not a new one, but it's still a good one. That we needed to be a more prosperous nation. Well, it would be a brave treasurer who'd actually admit that we might have a less prosperous nation. That doing nothing was not an option, even though in my view that's actually what he did. That the days of borrow and spend must come to an end. It's rhyming, it's good. The era of entitlement is over. That one's been around for a while. It's time to face the facts. The time to fix the budget is now. Any new taxes are now referred to, by the way, as tax adjustments, not new taxes. So notwithstanding the fact that they have to be voted on by the Senate, and Alan Oster has explained to me that that's the definition of a new tax in the budget, is one that the Senate has to agree to. These are not new taxes, they are tax adjustments. Tony Abbott promised before the last election that he wanted to be an infrastructure Prime Minister. And Joe Hockey followed that theme last night. He said that shovels will soon start moving. And then he rattled off a project in each and every state. There was one in WA, one in South Australia. The East-West Link got a mention here in Victoria, something in New South Wales, something in Queensland. And even in Tasmania, there is a freeway that they are going to do something with. So the shovels are going to start moving. But the one I really liked was the one he came out with at the end. He said, "We are now a nation of lifters, not leaners." And you sort of got a sense of blokes on a building site, you know, if they're unionised, they'll be leaning against a shovel, but, you know, if they're subcontractors, if they're working for themselves, they'll be getting stuck in. So there's a lot of good imagery in last night's budget. Okay, now, I'm going to go a bit Herald Sun on you now. I do now write for the Herald Sun, so I have an excuse for doing this, and go through the losers and the winners. Because that's what all the papers have done this morning. The Age has done it, the SMH, even the Financial Review. Losers and winners in the budget. You know, it's like a football final. If this is, you know, Alan Oster and other economists' grand final day, then for all of us it's the same thing. Some of us will lose and some of us will win. High income earners. The 2% deficit levy now goes on top of the Medicare levy. The top marginal tax rate is now 49%. Now, we're told this will only last a few years until maybe the budget's back into surplus, but, you know, I don't know. Levies have a habit of hanging around. I've just got a funny feeling that this one will be one of them. Pensions. A lot of what Joe Hockey did last night was to not change things too much, but change the rate at which they'll increase in the future. I believe from 2017, pensions will now rise with inflation and not with average male weekly earnings. And for the last several decades, inflation has been below earnings growth. So it doesn't sort of affect pensioners now, but it will affect them in the future. Another loser is me. I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1967. I used to think I was young. Now I know I'm in middle to advanced middle age. It's distressing. Joe Hockey has said that in 2035, when I contemplate retirement age 70, that in fact I will have to wait until I'm 70. This is for everybody born after 1965. You might lie about your age, but you can't lie about it to the government when it comes to getting a pension anymore. Working families. What is a rich person these days? It's now $100,000. And by the way, I don't think that threshold is going to change. So as there's bracket creep in the tax system, as average male weekly earnings or female or any other sort of earnings go through the tax brackets, the government just quietly collects more revenue. I think the same sort of thing is going to happen. That the cut-off point for benefits, like family tax benefits A and B, will stay at around $100,000. And in 10 years' time, when $100,000 is not rich anymore, you'll still be regarded as rich by the Welfare Office. Foreigners will lose out. Foreign aid is going to be cut. Already, I believe, the detention centres on Manus Island and Nauru actually count as foreign aid, which sort of makes you think that if we were to get mean to foreigners, how would we do that? Because our aid involves opening a detention centre. My father said to me last week that if you were going to sell a house in Canberra, that last week would have been a good time to do it. Because this week, 8% of unnamed government bodies, 70 of them are going to be shut down. Shut down. I mean, you know, Canberra, if you ever go up there, and I don't advise you to do it unless you like going to the War Museum, you know, Canberra is a very funny place. Everybody is a public servant. Everybody has a job title that doesn't mean anything. 16,500 of them are about to lose their jobs. I don't think the mood is going to be very good in Canberra this morning. Rent-seeking businesses. Fortunately, and I mean this tongue-in-cheek, but fortunately for the government, the car industry is shut down. That proves that there's no point in giving any business a subsidy. Guess what? The era of subsidies are over. Former MPs. My mother is one of these. No more gold travel card. She's very disappointed. And a bit of a sting in the tail, and Al and I spoke about this, but it does seem that in a few years, the states are going to have their federal government grants for hospitals cut back. Now, I heard a number of $80 billion, which can't be true, but it's a lot of money. And one thing that I think could happen in the next few years is that the states, when they start having direct government grants for things like hospitals cut back, they will all petition the federal government for the GST to be increased. And remember, if the states are asking for it, that means it's not the federal government's responsibility when they have to do it. For reasons that I've never understood, the GST or any changes to the GST have always been off the table. It's as though the political battle that John Howard had back in 2000 and 2001 cannot possibly be fought again. Okay, so who are the winners? Well, former MPs are also winners. Now, Joe Hockey has made a big thing about freezing current MPs' salaries for a year, even though, as it turns out, the Remuneration Tribunal wasn't going to increase them anyway. something a lot of people don't know is that the long tail of retired politicians, that is ones who entered Parliament before I think 2005, get this wonderful pension, and it's for their life, and it's paid to them when they leave politics, not when they retire like the rest of us. But here's the most important thing. When they first leave politics, it's based on a proportion of the wage they were then receiving. So if they were a minister, they might get 70% of a minister's wage. If they're a backbencher, the same ratio applies. But it gets adjusted up every time current MPs increase their pay. And if there's one thing that former MPs know, their current colleagues, the ones who are still in Parliament, will generally look to always increase their pay. So when current MPs' pay starts going up again after next year, all the former MPs who are smarting about the loss of their gold card will see their pensions going up again. All but the largest companies will have a corporate tax cut. Now, I've got to say, this is manna for accountants. The corporate tax rate has been 30% for a long time. Because it's a round number, easily divisible by 10, it's quite easy to work out franking credits. However, when it changes to 28.5%, it's going to get extraordinarily difficult to work out what franking credits are. Another winner in the tax accountant, tax planning area is, well, people who look to, how should we put this, restructure their affairs, who say that I might have been born a person, but now I'm a corporate trustee of a family trust. Now maybe just a company. Who knows, I might be a sole trader one day if the tax office makes that an appropriate thing to do. Now think about this. The top personal tax rate is going up to 49%. At the same time, the company rate is being cut to 28.5%. There is a more than 20 percentage point gap between a top-level wage earner and a company. What do you reckon that's going to do for people's tax structuring efforts over the next few years? Hey, I don't know, even though I work in that area. But I can tell you, there's going to be a lot more family trusts with corporate trustees out there after this week. Mining companies, Clive Palmer-Willing, and he's proving to be a very difficult person to negotiate with, the government is finding. The carbon and the mining taxes could still go, or who knows, maybe they won't. Older people who want to work do quite well. The federal government will now bribe other firms to give you a job. The problem I have is that old is now defined as over 50. There's a lot of new definitions here. Over $100,000 is rich, over 50 years old, it's terrible. Younger job seekers are winners. Why? Well, even though they're not going to be able to get the dole now until they're 25, as Joe Hockey said last night, they'll benefit because they have a greater sense of self. I remember 12 years ago there was a show on television called Life Support. Life Support. And it was a series of just sketches. I found it very funny. It got axed after one season. But one of the characters in it was a South African doctor called, "Hi, I'm Dr. Rudy." And what he said at Christmas time to save money was to give children the gift of imagination. And they showed them giving his children empty boxes. They'd open them and there was the gift of imagination. I think the greatest sense of self can also be found in an empty box.